Good evening, explorers. I'm Explorer Torie, and welcome to Native Nevada Nature, a chance for you to explore the outdoors right from the comfort of your own home. This is a presentation from the Nevada Conservation League where we highlight one plant or one animal species each week right here on our Facebook Live page. This is an educational presentation for all ages to watch, enjoy, and learn, so I hope you do at least one of those things. Throughout the presentation, if you have any questions about our specific plant species we're going to be talking about, or conservation in general, go ahead and just type them in the Facebook comment section if you're watching this live, and I will get to them at the end of the presentation. Now, it's time to present our next plant species for Native Nevada Nature, and it is the Single-Leaf Pinyon Pine. Full mouthful. Single-leaf pinyon can also be spelt with the Y or with the tilde over the N. Its genus species is pretty easy. It's Pinus monophylla, which literally translates to single-leaf pine. You always remember its genus species. But there's something very important about single-leaf pinyon pine. It is one of Nevada's state trees. If you watch my other Native Nevada Nature on the bristlecone pine, then you'll know that that is also one of Nevada's state trees. But you'll have to go back to my other episodes if you missed that one. We designated the single-leaf pinyon as our official state tree in 1953. The bristlecone pine was adopted in 1987, much later. But this is our original state tree, and we're going to learn all about that this episode. So now you know a little bit about its history. Let's go on and talk about how to identify single-leaf pinyon. So a mature single-leaf pinyon is typically a very short tree. It's only about 20 to 40 feet tall. Usually has a rounded top or flat-topped crown with multiple upswept branches due to the lack of self-pruning, so it doesn't take care of itself, so it kind of looks like a mess. And you can see the picture on the left-hand side is a pretty good representation of what a single-leaf pinyon would look like. If you imagine like on TV or even out in the wilderness, most pine trees kind of have that, triangular look where they kind of look groomed and, very typical pine tree look. That is not single-leaf pinyon pine. Kind of just looks like a big octopus sprouting out its branches everywhere. The bark on the tree is smooth and thin on young trees, and it forms deep, irregular fixtures and ridges with thin scales that are up to an inch thick with age. The wood itself is light and soft, not too strong or resinous. The needles of the single-leaf pinyon are solitary, hence its name, single-leaf pinyon. They are rigid and are about 1 to 1.4 inches in length. The sheaths of the needles are deciduous, meaning that they leave every season. However, pinyon pine is known to be an evergreen species, meaning it will be green all year round. The single needle, the leaf, is unique among pines of the world because they are known to be long-lived. They live to be about 5 to 12 years. Their longevity is considered an extreme expression of evergreenness, giving the tree the ability to conserve nutrients and take advantage of its short, favorable conditions. Let's see, the single-leaf pinyon bears ovulate cones that are long and thick with scales. They're about 1.4 to 2.2 inches in length. They bear large cones that are heavy, moderately thin-shelled, edible, and wingless. And they usually drop down to the floor and make a huge litter pile right under the tree. So I have a couple of pictures. The first one at the top left hand is a pinyon pine cone that actually still has some pinyon seeds right in there. So you can get a look of that. If you go down, you'll see a fresh female cone, nice and green, newly made. And then you'll see that collection of what they tend to look like after they've fallen off the tree. Pinyon nuts, also known as pine nuts, have an outstanding nutritional value. The shelled nuts of single-leaf pinyon have approximately 9.5% protein, 23% fat, and 54% carbohydrates. They are very comparable to pecans. They contain all 20 amino acids and about 8 of the 9 essential amino acids, and they are more abundant than most other nuts or seeds. They are especially rich in certain fatty acids. They're comprising about 42 to 42.5% fatty acid total, and 80% of the fatty acids are polyunsaturated, so unsaturated fats. The nuts also provide significant amounts of vitamin A, thiamine, riboflavin, and niacin. So a pretty hearty thing to eat, especially out here in the desert. That's probably why it was a very important source for indigenous tribes. One thing to note about single-leaf pinyon pine is that there are many different types of pinyon pines found throughout Nevada. There's also a chance for pinyon pine to hybridize and kind of breed with other different species to kind of make these combination of species. And there are subspecies of pinyon pine as well. So let's touch base on the first. There is a second pinyon pine species you can find here in Nevada. It is called the two-needle pinyon pine. This is Pinus edulis. It's also known as the Colorado pinyon. It's pretty common. You can find it along Nevada, along the lines of the Utah, Colorado area. If you look at this picture to the left, kind of migrating into the picture of the right, you could see that that is a picture of Colorado pinyon, and you could see that it has 2 needles coming out per sheath instead of just one, so that's probably the easiest way you could tell them apart. There have been hybrids of the Colorado and the single-leaf pinyon that occur in 3 geographical zones along the margin where their distributions overlap. The largest and most extensive zone is along the eastern margin of the Great Basin in central Utah. There have been also hybrids of single-leaf pinyon and Sierra Juarez pinyon that have been found scattered in places of northern Baja. And as I mentioned, there are 3 subspecies of pinyon pine, or single-leaf pinyon pine. The first one is Pinus monophylla, subspecies monophylla. They are most of the range in Nevada, except for the areas that I'm going to mention below. The needles are known to be stout, bright blue-green, and the cones end up being about 2 to 3 inches in length. They are known to be longer than broad, so longer than fatter. The next subspecies is Pinus monophylla, subspecies Phalanx. These occur in slopes of lower Colorado River and adjacent tributaries of St. George, Utah, and into Silver City, New Mexico. The needles here are very closely related to Colorado pinyon, which they hybridize with. This classification is based off the presence of single needle sheaths that are brought into doubt by reporting the trees from both Pinus monophylla and Pinus edulis. Basically, their areas are overlapping. And the last one is Pinus monophylla subspecies californica. This is found in northwest Nevada, southwest through southeastern California. This is known as having needles that are gray-green, and the cones are about 1 to 2.5 inches. So they are known to be broader than longer, so much fatter. A lot of these are very subtle differences, but you can guess that if you see a pinyon pine here in Nevada, it's either going to be single leaf or 2-needle pinyon pine, or maybe in hybridization of both. All right, this is a map of the region for single-leaf pinyon pine. It has 3 separate regions showing the different types of areas where you can find all 3 different subspecies. Generally, you can find single-leaf pinyon pine in pinyon juniper woodlands, which are montane juniper woodlands, which you can find Utah juniper, California juniper, many types of juniper. If you want to learn a little bit more about juniper, you could check out my previous Native Nevada Nature on Utah juniper. And it touches base a lot about these pinyon juniper woodlands, so I won't go too much into them. But you can find these areas all across southwestern United States, including Nevada, Utah, California. There's a branch that goes through Arizona into New Mexico, and then one that goes down into Baja California. You can find pinyon juniper woodlands in elevations between 4,500 to 7,500 feet. Fun fact, pinyon juniper woodlands cover over 55.6 million acres across the U.S. Single-leaf pinyon has the largest area and distribution of any known pinyon species and pine species, therefore a large degree of genetic variation. All right, so this picture was taken up by Mount Charleston. It's a pretty typical place of where you can find pinyon pine. The single-leaf pinyon often grows with Utah juniper, California juniper, and Sierra juniper, with an understory of shrubs and grasses such as sagebrush, saltbush, and rabbitbrush. The single-leaf pinyon has adapted to a variety of sites. It usually grows on pediments, dry, rocky slopes, and ridges. It is rarely found on the valley floors. As I mentioned, it's in elevations between 4,000 and 7,000, which tends to be montane areas. So pretty much in almost every montane mountainous area in Nevada has one of the pinyon species, more than likely single-leaf pinyon. Another thing about it is that single-leaf pinyon is believed to be the most xeric pine in the United States. It is frost-resistant, tolerant of drought, and requires full sunlight for maximum growth. It can survive in annual precipitation ranges from 8 to 18 inches. And they have an extensive lateral root system, giving it the ability to penetrate in open areas between tree canopies and being able to extract water and nutrients. Its ability to evade adjacent shrublands may also be related to the tree's ability to maintain a seasonally stable xylem water potential and thereby endure drought better than other shrubs. There's been studies in Nevada that suggested that the ability for the single-leaf pinyon to exist in so many different environmental conditions, it's not a function of their variable ecophysiological responses, but an opportunistic response to the availability of resources and conditions suitable for growth. Basically saying that it does not just function well in different environments, but its ability to be able to get nutrients and water in almost any environment allow it to be able to be in a wide range of environmental conditions. All right, let's talk about the life cycle of a single-leaf pinyon. What would it be like to be this pinyon pine species from the day-to-day? So reproduction in a single-leaf pinyon is by seed. It does not naturally occur by vegetative means. It is monoecious, means that it presents both sexes within each individual, so each tree is male and female. And they are wind populated, or pollinated. Cone and seed development require 3 seasons and about 26 months. That's a very best guess for when they would actually develop seeds. Once they're pollinated, the growth of the pollen tube undergoes another winter dormancy period just before fertilization. And after fertilization, the seeds develop rapidly and they mature and they disperse about 6 months later, about the second autumn after pollination. With so many time between stages of coning and seed crops, they are exposed to different variables between each seed crop, such as weather, predation, internal competition for resources between previous and current year's cones, Therefore, seed production is very highly variable from tree to tree, year to year, and place to place. Single-leaf pinyon generally begins bearing cones at about 35 years of age, and they begin producing good seed crops at about 75 to 100 years old. Oof, these are long-lived. And they reach a maximum production of about 160 to 200 years. Single-leaf pinyon exhibits region-wide synchrony between cone production. So usually big groups will produce cones every 2 to 3 years. Some seeds may be produced every year if there's favorable conditions. You might have remembered when I mentioned the seeds or the pine nuts that are growing on the cones that they are totally wingless. That's unique because most pine trees, their seeds have little wings that allow them to disperse in the air. Well, these are wingless, so that means seed dispersal is totally dependent on vertebrate dispersers that store the seeds in food caches, and when they're unconsumed by those vertebrate species, they germinate. This dispersal mechanism is a good example of co-evolved mutualistic plant vertebrates relationships. So they've evolved wholeheartedly to depend on animals distributing their seeds and having them germinate. Well, if you remember, we mentioned 30 years, 100 years. These pinyon seeds are short-lived despite their long age, and their dormancy is only a temporary seed bank. So fresh seeds have about 85 to 90% viability, but it decreases in a year or less. Pretty much they need to germinate immediately, and so most seeds germinate the spring the following dispersal. They require about 28 to 90 days of cold stratification for germination. And germination and establishment are most likely when favorable moisture conditions follow a seed crop year. So single-leaf pinyon are slow growing. Dominant tree requires about 60 years to get 6.6 feet. A little bit taller than I am, 60 years. It takes about 150 years for them to attain 28 feet, which puts them at the average of their height. It all depends on tree sites, greatly influenced by competition and for limiting water supply. They are slow growing, therefore they are long-lived. On fire-safe sites, the trees can monopolize resources and live for a span of over 350 years or more. Dominant pinyons are about 400 years old and have been known to reach ages 800 to 1,000 years. Mature single-leaf pinyon trees, which are over 200 years old, are relatively uncommon. There's a study that shows of the 20 million acres between pinyon juniper stands across Nevada and Utah, about half are estimated to be 40 to 120 years old, and almost 9% in Nevada is over 200 years of age. So not many make it to be 200 or years older in age. A lot of them are the ones that are maturing, that are coming in and having to fight for competitions. But if you can keep on top, you can live for a long time. All right, let's talk about the community role of single-leaf pinyon pine within these pinyon juniper woodlands. So these areas provide shelter and forage for numerous species of wildlife, many of which are highly dependent on these woodlands in these areas. They're habitat for large mammals such as mule deer, white-tailed deer, pronghorn, desert bighorn sheep, elk, wild horses, mountain lions, and bears. Several different predators such as gray foxes, bobcats, coyotes, weasels, skunks, ringtails, they use their prey here, or find their prey here. And many different bird and reptile species find their food and shelter here. Pinyon juniper forests are important for wintering areas for the Clark's nutcrackers. Touch base on Clark's nutcracker for the Utah juniper if you want to learn more about that particular bird species. But plenty of different birds and small mammals feed on the seeds themselves, including white-footed pinyon mice, chipmunks, gold-mantled ground squirrels, wood rats, white-breasted nuthatches, Clark nutcrackers, and chickadees. There have been black bears, deer, and porcupines that feed on the seeds, bark, and the foliage of the pinyon pine. and there have been mountain sheep that browse the foliage and the twigs. The inner bark is a staple food for the mountain pine beetle, as well as the fungus causing pinyon blister rust. Even the pitch, the dripping resin from the pine cones, is feasted upon pitch midges and is harvested by the nest of different bees. Sawflies feed on the needles and the pollen, while gall midges live in the galls that occur at the needle sheath. So basically, so many different insects, mammal species, bird species, wildlife in general, all depend on single-leaf pinyon pine and this pinyon juniper woodland to survive and live. But it's not only just animals and insects that rely on these areas. There's a big, deep history involved with single-leaf pinyon pine and pinyon pines in general. So first off, Pinus monophylla has been studied regarding prehistoric occurrence upon fossil needles and have found pack rat middens and fossil pollen records. All of these subtypes of single-needed pinyon have maintained distinct ranges over the last 40,000 years. Although northern species expanded greatly through Utah and Nevada since the end of the Pleistocene at about 11,700 years ago. The Southern California variety has been found to occur within Joshua Tree National Park in the last 47,000 years. Oof. All right, let's bring it back a little bit closer to the current year. So, pinyon juniper ecosystems have had a cultural, spiritual, economic, aesthetic, and medicinal value to Native American peoples for centuries. And the single-leaf pinyon has provided food, fuel, medicine, shelter to indigenous tribes for over thousands of years. That pitch from the single-leaf pinyon is used as an adhesive, caulking material, and paint binder. It was used medicinally like chewed gum as well. And of course, it's been a valuable food source. So we're going to go a little bit deeper into that. So traditionally, different tribes of California, the Great Basin, and southwestern U.S. have utilized this tree for fuel wood and for pine nuts for food. The Washoe made pinyon supple branches into stirring sticks for mixing pine nut soup. Pinyon pitch is melted and applied by different tribes as an outer covering for baskets to make them watertight or used to waterproof and repair pottery vessels. The tree's large red-orange to chocolate brown seeds have been an important food to indigenous tribes for a millennia and are extremely important today. The cones are still gathered in the fall by the tribes in California, the Great Basin, and Southwest, and they are roasted, parched, shelled, and ground into a meal, and made into nutritious pine nut soup, mush, and cakes. Since the trees produce crops every several years, each family relies on a series of groves, rotating harvests at different groves, depending upon which grove is most productive. Since trees can reach more than 600 years, some of the tribal pinyon gathering sites have been visited for many generations. For earlier Euro-American settlers of the Great Basin, they logged pinyon trees for wood, used it for fuel for heating, cooking, and applied to steam engines. Pinyon charcoal was used to smelt silver oils, and it became Nevada's #1 industry in 1860 and 1870s. In the last 3 decades, public land agencies have started to large tracts of pinyon trees. They've chained them off and reseeded large areas with non-native grasses, such as wheatgrass, to increase grasses for livestock. One of the other uses for single-leaf pinyon include fence posts, Christmas trees, and edible seeds. Now, you might be thinking, Explorer Torie, how do I get a hold of some of these delicious-looking pine nuts? I want to be a forager on my own. Well, let's look at the history of harvesting pine nuts, and then we'll go into how you guys can do it. So, historically, there are 2 major methods for utilizing the pine nuts by different tribes. The first method is to take a hooked stick that brings down the flexible limbs of the tree, and the green immature cones are hand twisted from the branches before they open and disperse their seeds. The hook stick can also be used to snap the cones off from the limbs. Sometimes children will climb up the trunks and handpick the cones, while others will use a ladder. The cones are placed in plastic buckets or a modern adaptation of gathering baskets. And a second gathering method is to wait until the cones open and then whip the trees with a pole, knocking down the seeds of the mature cones and collecting them from the ground. All right, so I do not recommend harvesting large amounts of pine nuts. They are, first off, a pain, but two, they are highly culturally important to Native American tribes and to the animal communities that depend on these pine nuts. But if you wanted to try to harvest them for yourself, just a one-time thing, or if you needed the resources, this is how you could do it. So first off, find a pinyon tree. You want to look between late summer, around August. You're going to be looking for those green female cones. You want to come back later on around Labor Day. You're going to take those green pine cones off. If you miss Labor Day, or if the squirrels beat you to them, you could try climbing a tree and putting the tarp under the tree and shaking the remaining pine nuts off. But if you're able to collect a couple of green pine cones, the two things that are required to open them up are dry and heat. So keep them in a high dry location. Some people say putting them in the oven. It is hot already in Nevada, so just put a lid on them and keep them outside. Wait until they open up and take the pine nuts. However, it's noted that not all pine nuts are good. Usually about 50 to 80% of them are good. General rule of thumb is the darker the color, the better the nut. If you want to know which ones are really good, soak the pine nuts in water, and if they float, those are not good. You want the ones that are sinking. Then you peel off the shells and enjoy. It is a very rigorous, long process. That's why they've been so important to Native American tribes. These indigenous tribes have worked centuries to perfect the technique, and it is no wonder why pine nuts are so expensive to buy in the store, because it is not worth somebody doing this on a regular basis. All right. Now that we've covered what pinyon pine is like here in modern day, it is time to look to the future. Time to look at the conservation status of single-leaf pinyon pine. So they are not currently listed on the endangered species list, and on the red list they are listed as least concern, noting that they have stable populations, so there have been no real records of them having any declined populations or in trouble of being endangered. But one thing to note is that nearly 70 taxa of narrow endemic plants, many of which are listed as threatened, endangered, sensitive, or have been considered for listing, are found in pinyon juniper communities and may somehow be dependent on the Pinyon Juniper Association. So it's important to have an understanding of their geology, their soils, their hydrology, biology, and ecology to have these protected species be an also important aspect of management decisions. So there are a few threats to single-leaf pinyon pine. First off, fire. They burn really readily. That's why they were used as wood fuel. When the tree reaches adulthood, indigenous tribes traditionally prune back the dead wood that accumulate. To protect the pinyon trees from fire, some tribes in California and Great Basin rake their litter and duff from under the pine nut trees and hand remove shrubs that might act as a fuel ladder during the fire. Basically, they have come to learn that cleaning the underbrush is a part of a routine and necessary maintenance to maintain these species. Also, pruning the tree back with the low-lying limbs that might be hanging down so those could not catch on fire as well. The other thing is that pinyon pine is also affected by many different infestations. There's a pinyon pine engraver, which is a bark beetle that inhibits the pinyon pine. This little brown beetle bores egg galleries along the grain of the wood. It also gets infected by dwarf mistletoe, which taps the pinyon limbs for water and nutrients, causing a hormonal balance, swelling of the plant, and acting as a food sump. Pinyon pine is subject to attacks by a host of other pathogens, most of which do not kill but do weaken it, including the needle cast fungi, which inhibits the needles, pinyon blister rust, which infects the living branches, and a disease called Electroderma disease, which upsets the hormone balance of causing bud stimulation. This leads to the production of extra branches, giving the tree kind of a brooming effect. It's also infected by brown Kermi rot, a heart rot of fungus, which decimates different older trees. It moves from the heartwood into the roots, rotting them, and the tree falls over. So there are definitely things that we need to watch out and maintain because of how important this one plant species and this community of pinyon juniper is on so many different plant and animal species in the area, and human communities as well. So continuing research and understanding of these areas is highly important for the preservation of them and other species. All right, that's all I have on single-leaf pinyon pine. If you guys have any questions about it, or any questions about pinyon juniper communities or conservation efforts in general, please just type them now in the Facebook comment section. If you want to know where I took these photos and videos, most of them are from Mount Charleston. A lot of pinyon juniper you can find up there. I also have some from the Desert National Wildlife Refuge along Long Canyon Trail, though I'm sure you could find it in many other locations. But that's where I got my footage from. All right, the first question we have is, why don't you answer your phone? If you have any particular interest for being involved in the Nevada Conservation League or conservation efforts, please let us know, and here we'll contact you directly. We are always looking to get into environmental action and doing events, so if you have any suggestions or want to be a part of that, please let us know, and we'll give you that information at the very end, and we'll contact you via Facebook and probably give you a phone call or a Zoom message. All right, I am very excited to have the ability to get some pinyon pines on my own, even though it's a very rigorous process. Make sure to get them before the birds get them. But the nice thing about single-leaf pinyon pine is that it gives you a chance to see a wide variety of different types of animal species, birds, insects, mammal species within these areas. So I challenge you to go out, explore these areas. Of course, maintain social distancing, make sure to not get too close to people. But when you get a chance, explore these montane areas and get a chance to see some great wildlife and some wonderful pine species up there. Well, with no more questions, I'm going to move on to our next topic. Speaking of checking out wildlife and specific to birds, this month for Black History, I'm going to be doing a spotlight on different types of biologists, ecologists within the United States. Sometimes the biologists kind of get overlooked in the environmental advocacy section, so I'm going to highlight a couple of them for this Black History Month. So the first person I have is John C. Robinson. He was born in 1959. He is an American biologist, an environmental advocate, and author. He studied biology at Iowa State University and devoted his entire career becoming a professional ornithologist, which is study of birds. He worked for the United States Department of Agriculture, Fish and Wildlife Service, and he served on the board of directors for American Birding Association. He is the recipient of the Audubon's Toyota Together Green Fellowship and the author of several ornithology reference books, including the North American Bird Reference Book, which is in my library right now. He is an African American environmentalist. A significant part of his advocacy work is focused on making minorities, in particular minority youth and young adults, more engaged with the environment through bird watching. He wrote about this in his book in 2008 titled Birding for Everyone, encouraging people of color to become bird watchers. So no matter who you are or where you live or where you're at, I highly recommend giving bird watching a chance. I know it's not for everybody, but it is for everyone interested. So to give you the opportunity for that, I'm inviting you to my event this Saturday at 1 p.m. Pacific time. It is the Southern Nevada Birding Guide. It's going to be presented by Red Rock Audubon, who are the birding experts in this area. They are going to be teaching us about backyard birding and how to get started into birding as a hobby. It's really cool no matter where you live, even if it's in an apartment or you have your own backyard or you like to hike or you just like to look. you'll get a chance to learn all the birds that you might even find in your own neighborhood. There's a worldwide bird count going on the following week, so take these tools and participate in the Great Backyard Bird Count, where you can contribute to the world population of birds. So, if you want to join, just like John C. Robinson, if you want to learn about birding and get involved within nature, highly recommend coming to this event this Saturday at 1 p.m. But that's all I have for Native Nevada Nature. Thank you guys for joining me once again this week. As always, it's a chance for you to learn some new species or some ones that you may be familiar with, but hopefully you learned something you've never known before. And for Black History Month, we'll also be touching base on some famous Black or African American individuals who have affected the ecology, biology communities. So hope you enjoy that next week. And until then, keep on exploring.